Good morning to everyone. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing called Climate Science, Assumptions, Policy Implications, and the Scientific Method. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement and then the ranking member. Today we will examine the scientific method as it relates to climate change. We must ensure that the underlying science that informs policy decisions is based on credible scientific methodology. I believe the climate is changing and that humans play a role. However, I also believe significant questions remain as to the extent. Our actions must be based on sound science. This is the only way we will be able to better address climate change. Before we impose costly government regulations, we should evaluate scientific uncertainties and ascertain the extent to which they make it difficult to quantify humans' contributions to climate change. Far too often, alarmist theories on climate science originate with scientists who operate outside of the principles of the scientific method. The scientific method is a simple process that has been used for centuries. It involves identifying a question, developing an hypothesis, constructing an experiment, and analyzing the results. If the results do not align with the original hypothesis, the hypothesis must be re-examined. The scientific method welcomes critiques so theories can be refined, and it avoids speculation about distant events for which there is no hard proof. Alarmist predictions amount to nothing more than wild guesses. The ability to predict far into the future is impossible. Anyone stating they know what the climate will be in 500 years, or even at the end of the century, is not credible. All too often, scientists ignore the basic tenets of science in order to justify their claims. Their ultimate goal appears to be to promote a personal agenda, even if the evidence doesn't support it. The scientific method is regarded as the foundation of modern science. It ensures that scientific experimentation is neither arbitrary nor subjective, and that results can be replicated. In the field of climate science, there is legitimate concern that scientists are biased in favor of reaching predetermined conclusions. This inevitably leads to alarmist findings that are wrongfully reported as facts. The scientific method also requires that for an hypothesis to become a theory, a repeated validation of the results, called reproducibility, should be possible. However, a recent survey found that 70% of scientific researchers have tried and failed to reproduce the experiments conducted by other scientists. The lack of reproducibility is a warning that the scientific method is not being followed and that the theory may lack credibility. To restore faith in science, we must uphold the principles of scientific integrity. For example, the Science Committee heard from whistleblowers that National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration employees put their, quote, thumb on the scale, end quote, during the analysis of data. This was done to arrive at politically correct results that would disprove the absence of global temperature increases from 1998 to 2012. More recently, NOAA admitted to committee staff that there was no legal justification for not complying with the committee's lawfully issued subpoena requesting information. In fact, we learned that it was simply a political decision to halt any further debate on the subject. This is professional misconduct, if not worse. A similar event unfolded in 2009. Emails from East Anglia University scientists were uncovered and revealed that they frequently violated principles of scientific integrity and attempted to halt debate about climate science. Much of climate science today appears to be based more on exaggerations, personal agendas, and questionable predictions than on the scientific method. Those who engage in such actions do a disservice to the American people and to their own profession. Only when scientists follow the scientific method can policymakers be confident that they are making the right decisions. Until then, the debate should continue. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling today's hearing on climate science. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here. I want to start off today by placing our current situation in some historical perspective. The existence of greenhouse effect was first proposed in the early 1800s. By the late 1800s, scientists began to theorize that increases in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere could lead to global warming. By 1960, scientists had shown that carbon dioxide was in fact increasing in the atmosphere, and humans were at least in part responsible for the increase. Scientific evidence of human-induced climate change rapidly increased through the 1970s. By 1982, even oil giant Exxon's own scientists were reporting to management that climate change due to carbon dioxide emissions was likely to occur, and that the effects of this climate change could be catastrophic. Since the early 80s, when Exxon internally acknowledged the reality of climate change, the scientific evidence confirming human-caused climate change has piled up at an incredible rate. The current scientific consensus on human-caused climate change is based on thousands of scientific studies conducted by thousands of scientists all across the globe. What does that word consensus actually mean? It means the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is composed of scientists from around the world, has concluded that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and that it is extremely likely that human influence was the dominant cause of global warming. The IPCC is not alone. The National Academies of Sciences has reached the same conclusion. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences is in virtually every major country on Earth has endorsed the IPCC's central conclusions on climate change. Most relevant scientific societies, including AAAS, the American Physical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and a host of others have also affirmed the overwhelming scientific evidence for human-caused climate change. Unfortunately, the long-established scientific understanding of the reality of climate change ends at the doorstep of the Republican National Committee. Republicans in Congress overwhelmingly reject or minimize the scientific consensus on climate change. In this, they follow the leader of the Republican Party, President Trump, who once claimed that climate change was a hoax perpetuated by China. Even on this committee on science, Republican members have postulated sometimes unique theories about climate change, some of which have become punchlines on late-night television. It saddens me, really, that the majority members of Congress and of this committee in particular consistently ignore the thousands of scientists around the world who maintain mainstream climate science views, and instead repeatedly call in the handful of preferred witnesses who are here today over and over again to testify. For instance, the 3 witnesses called by the majority today have collectively appeared in front of the Congress at least 20 times over the past decade. Disturbingly, the majority's unwillingness to accept the strong scientific consensus on climate change has led them to harass scientists who disagree with them. For example, the majority on this committee has issued subpoenas for emails of climate scientists at NOAA, taking a page out of the playbook of fossil industry funded front groups who has harassed climate scientists across the country. In the process, our majority has brought condemnation upon this once great committee from across the scientific community. Perhaps in retaliation for this inconvenient climate scientists are now being targeted with massive budget cuts by Republicans in the White House and Congress. These cuts would devastate our ability to understand and mitigate the future effects of climate change. I sincerely hope that someday soon the Committee on Science will cease lecturing and harassing scientists and instead return to listening and supporting them. America will be far better off if we do. And finally, I'm attaching a report prepared by the Democratic staff to my opening statement. This report details the majority's nearly two-year-long investigation into climate science paper that was prepared by NOAA scientists and published in the Journal of Science in June of 2015. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Do you want that report made a part of the record?
Yes.
Okay, without objection, that report will be made a part of the record. I might also add that I know the Commerce Committee is conducting another and their own investigation. If nothing else, it probably all proves that the science is not yet settled. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, the chairman of the Environment Subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, panelists, for being with us today. I appreciate it. Thank you for calling this important hearing today. As we move forward as policymakers in this new Congress and with a new administration, it is important that we have the best available data to make informed decisions. It is also important that this data is grounded in sound science that is not biased politically or part of any larger political agenda. Our nation's climate change policy cannot be taken lightly because the stakes are enormous. We simply must eliminate costly, unjustifiable regulations. For example, President Obama's climate change actions, such as the Clean Power Plan, have been estimated to cost billions annually, while having a negligible impact on the environment. It is for this very reason that President Trump issued an executive order yesterday requiring the EPA to revisit this regulation. Not only did the previous administration mute honest discussions that went against President Obama's politicized climate change legacy, but it also perpetuated scandal in the industry. Dr. Bates' concerns regarding the Carl study at NOAA is one such instance. The American economy should not be trifled with. If we're to make far-sighted laws and regulations, the findings of climate research need to be clear, not muddled with bad science, name-calling, or scandals. Unfortunately, this muddling has tarnished the reputation of science and made many Americans wary of supporting climate change regulations, understanding that the underlying science is subject to manipulation. Rigorous scientific debate should never be silenced, and we must vigorously confront instances in which scientific integrity falls short. I look forward to an honest, level-headed discussion today, not just about what we know about climate change, but also about the uncertainties that still need to be addressed. Thank you, Chairman Smith. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. And the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, the ranking member of the Environment Subcommittee, is recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's truly unfortunate that the Science Committee is holding this hearing today. We're spending valuable time on efforts to try to discredit science and question the scientific process when we should be looking for ways to advance scientific research. Climate change is not a partisan issue. People who fish in Oregon, farmers in Oklahoma, servicemen and women in Virginia and around the country are all living with the results of climate change, regardless of their political affiliation. The economic, human health, and environmental consequences of climate change are well known, and our understanding about how to address the causes of climate change continues to improve. At a time when people in the United States and around the world are facing threats from rising sea levels, oceans that are becoming more acidic, more frequent and severe weather events, record droughts and flooding, and rising global temperatures, it's critical that we support scientific research about climate and that we build on rather than break down decades' worth of progress on this issue. Fortunately, 17 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have introduced legislation with a commitment to address climate change. The Science Committee should return to being a forum for robust discussions about our nation's scientific priorities, celebration of our scientific achievements, and development of bipartisan legislation that improves our understanding of science. Over the years, these efforts have helped grow the economy and created new jobs and new industries. Let's return to that science committee rather than one where science is attacked, and there's not enough focus on bipartisan work that benefits the millions of American people who are concerned that increased carbon emissions threaten our country and our planet. This hearing is going to follow a familiar pattern with familiar faces offering fringe perspectives. We've heard from the three majority witnesses in the past. Based on the testimony they've submitted, their positions on this issue have not changed. Science is not about trust or belief or personal agendas. Science is about knowledge and understanding. Scientists put their research and findings through rigorous peer review and constantly seek to improve our understanding of the world through scientific process. Characterizing well-understood science as a trust exercise undermines the general principle of scientific integrity. There is a difference between a political position that denies the reality of climate change and scientific fact that climate change is real. Too often there's confusion about those distinctions in this room. Again, we should focus on solutions to the climate change problem, not distractions from the reality. I look forward to hearing about possible solutions from Dr. Michael Mann today, a distinguished climate scientist who has been at the forefront of the international scientific community's efforts to examine, understand, and respond to global warming and the consequences it has brought to our planet. And I hope that the day comes soon when we can all focus on and discuss solutions to climate change. And as the chair of the Environment Subcommittee said, the stakes are enormous. I hope it's not too late for our children, our grandchildren, and generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. We have a particularly distinguished panel today, and let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Judith Curry, President of the Climate Forecast Applications Network and Professor Emeritus at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Dr. Curry performs extensive research that focuses on air and sea interactions, climate feedback processes associated with clouds and sea ice, and the climate dynamics of hurricanes. Dr. Curry also recently served on the NASA Advisory Council Earth Science Subcommittee, the DOE Biological and Environmental Research Advisory Committee, and the National Academy's Climate Research Committee, the Space Studies Board, and the NOAA Climate Working Group. Dr. Curry received her PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Chicago. Our second witness is Dr. John Christy, Professor and Director of the Earth System Science Center at the University of Alabama at Huntsville and Alabama's state climatologist. Dr. Christy has served as lead author, contributing author, and reviewer of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments. In addition, he was awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement. In 2002, he was elected a Fellow of the American Meteorological Society. Dr. Christy received his master's degree and PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Illinois. Our third witness today is Dr. Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science and Director of the Earth System Science Center at Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Mann's research involves the use of theoretical models and observational data to understand Earth's climate system. In addition, he was a lead author on the Observed Climate Variability and Change chapter of the IPCC Third Scientific Assessment Report in 2001. Dr. Mann is a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Mann received his bachelor's degree in physics and applied math from the University of California at Berkeley, his master's degree in physics from Yale University, and his PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale University. Our final witness is Dr. Roger Pielke, Professor of the Environmental Studies Department at the University of Colorado. Dr. Pielke is the founding director and a faculty affiliate of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research, and from 2001 to 2016 was a fellow of the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences. Dr. Pielke previously served as a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. In addition, Dr. Pielke is a senior fellow of the Breakthrough Institute and has held several academic appointments. Dr. Pielke received his bachelor's degree in mathematics, his master's degree in public policy, and his PhD in political science, all from the University of Colorado. We welcome you all, and Dr. Curry will begin with your testimony.
I thank the chairman and the committee for the opportunity to offer testimony on this important topic. Prior to 2010, I felt that supporting the IPCC consensus on human-caused climate change was the responsible thing to do. That all changed for me in November 2009, following the leaked ClimateGate emails that illustrated the sausage-making and even bullying that went into building that consensus. I came to the growing realization that I had fallen into the trap of groupthink in supporting the IPCC consensus. I began making an independent assessment of topics in climate science that had the most relevance to policy. I concluded that the high confidence of the IPCC's conclusions were not justified, and that there were substantial uncertainties in our understanding of how the climate system works. I realized that the premature consensus on human-caused climate change was harming scientific progress because of the questions that don't get asked and the investigations that aren't made. We therefore lack the kinds of information to more broadly understand climate variability and societal vulnerabilities. As a result of my analyses that challenged the IPCC consensus, I have been publicly called a serial climate disinformer, anti-science, and a denier by a prominent climate scientist. I've been publicly called a denier by a U.S. senator. My motives have been questioned by a U.S. congressman in a letter sent to the president of Georgia Tech. While there is much noise in the media and blogosphere and professional advocacy groups, I'm mostly concerned about the behavior of other scientists. A scientist's job is to continually challenge their own biases and ask, how could I be wrong? Scientists who demonize their opponents are behaving in a way that is antithetical to the scientific process. These are the tactics of enforcing a premature theory for political purpose. There is enormous pressure for climate scientists to conform to the so-called consensus. This pressure comes from federal funding agencies, universities, and professional societies and scientists themselves. Reinforcing this consensus are strong monetary, reputational, and authority interests. Owing to these pressures and the gutter tactics of the academic debate on climate change, I recently resigned my tenured faculty position at Georgia Tech. The pathology of both the public and scientific debates on climate change motivated me to research writings on the philosophy and sociology of science, argumentation from the legal perspective, the policy process, and decision-making under deep uncertainty. My analysis of the problems in climate science from these broader perspectives have been written in a series of posts at my blog, Climate Etc., and also in 4 published journal articles. My reflections on these issues are summarized in my written testimony. The complexity of the climate change problem provides much scope for disagreement among reasonable and intelligent people. Why do scientists disagree about the causes of climate change? The historical data is sparse and inadequate. There's disagreement about the value of different classes of evidence, notably the value of global climate models and paleoclimate reconstructions. There's disagreement about the appropriate logical framework for linking and assessing the evidence. And scientists disagree over assessment of areas of ambiguity and ignorance. Policymakers bear the responsibility of the mandate that they give to panels of scientific experts. In the case of climate change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change framed the problem too narrowly. This narrow framing of the climate change problem essentially preordained the conclusions from the IPCC assessment process. There are much better ways to assess science for policymakers than a consensus-seeking process that serves to stifle disagreement and debate. Expert panels with diverse perspectives should handle controversies and uncertainties by assessing what we know, what we don't know, and where the major areas of disagreement and uncertainties lie. Let's make scientific debate about climate change great again. This concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Dr. Christy.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and committee members, for this opportunity to speak about climate change. I'm John Christy, professor of atmospheric science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville and Alabama's state climatologist. I have served in many climate roles, including lead author of the United Nations IPCC. My main research is building data sets from scratch to help understand what the climate is doing. Of concern today is the proposition that the traditional scientific method has not been consistently followed in today's pronouncements about climate change made by so-called official panels. Science is simply a method that describes a pathway to discover information. In the method, the scientist makes a claim or a hypothesis about something and then proceeds to test that claim against independent data to see if the claim is false or not. In the first figure, next, I show a vertical cross-section of the atmospheric temperature trends, surfaces at the bottom, stratosphere at the top, and the poles on either end, tropics in the middle. This figure is simply a claim common to climate models that the bulk atmosphere in the last 38 years should show considerable atmospheric warming due to extra greenhouse gases, especially in the outlined tropical section. So here we have a testable claim because we have observations with which to compare. In the next figure, I show the temperature progression from 32 model groups with their average in red of that tropical section. We are interested in the red curve because that is the consensus upon which claims of future climate change are based. But don't overlook the wide spread of model results in the dashed lines. They're all over the place. There is no clear certainty on what the climate might do in the future. I also show observations on this chart of the bulk atmospheric trend. You see with symbols, circles, squares, and diamonds, based upon 3 different types of measuring systems: balloons, satellites, and a merged product used in weather forecasting called reanalyses. Each of these methods has 3 or 4 different groups contributing a result. This figure looks confusing, so to simplify the test of the claim, I show the next figure, which is just the trend lines that are being compared. What is obvious is that the warming hypothesized and claimed by climate models to have already occurred has not. The warming is clearly overstated. When these trends are formally tested, the scientific conclusion is that the consensus of the climate models, the red line, fails to represent reality of the actual changes in the bulk atmosphere, and that's a foundational climate metric. Little known to many is that this result was displayed in the most recent IPCC, buried deep and without comment in Chapter 10's supplementary information. In my written testimony, I show that using that IPCC diagram, the same result as shown here occurs. The warming rate of models on which policy is based can be scientifically falsified as representing reality. Interestingly, the IPCC result, in that result, the models without extra greenhouse gases reproduce the actual observations very well. Indeed, I am a co-author of a report in which we used a statistical model to reproduce, to a large degree, the atmospheric temperature trends without the need for extra greenhouse gases. In other words, it seems that Mother Nature can cause such temperature trends on her own, which should be of no surprise. It is astounding and disturbing that such contradictory evidence to the IPCC's main model-based conclusion that humans cause most of the recent warming could be ignored so gallantly and willfully. In my view, the dispassionate analysis of scientific results on which policy decisions are based was sidetracked by those who control the IPCC documents. This problem is pervasive in climate science. Grand compilations such as the IPCC, the National Climate Assessment, pronouncements from scientific societies who never do any scientific work on the problem, by the way, for their results, and even EPA's endangerment finding are on the whole written by those who are not scientifically dispassionate. And as such, the traditional method of science was circumvented, in my opinion. I'll close by noting that when someone says that precisely measuring the role of, quote, human activity on the climate is something very challenging to do, and there's tremendous disagreement about the degree of impact, end quote, that person is making a scientifically defensible statement as demonstrated by my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christy and Dr. Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Michael Mann. I am Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State University, where I also direct the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State. My research interests are in understanding the behavior of the Earth's climate system. I have served on several National Academy panels and committees. I am a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Received numerous prestigious awards. I have authored more than 200 publications and several books. It is important to make clear at the outset that there is extremely broad agreement among the world's scientists on the basic facts of human-caused climate change. The U.S. National Academy of Sciences, all of the scientific societies of all the industrial nations, more than 30 scientific societies around the U.S., at least 97% of scientists publishing in the field. All of these have concluded, based on the evidence, that climate change is real, is human-caused, and is having adverse impacts on us, our economy, and our planet. Yet we find ourselves at this hearing today with three individuals who represent that tiny minority that reject this consensus or downplay its significance, and only one, myself, who is in the mainstream. That's 25%. That's a far cry from 97%. An inauspicious start for an honest discussion about science. I have devoted my life to understanding the natural world. In the case of climate science, it turns out that this lifelong journey of scientific discovery has also enormous societal implications. Earlier this week, for example, my colleagues and I published a study demonstrating that climate change is altering the jet stream in a way that is making extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat waves, more likely. Events like the 2011 Texas and Oklahoma heat wave and drought, the 2015 California wildfires that affected the lives of so many Americans. Other recent studies have shown the fingerprints of human-caused climate change on extreme events like the fires that devastated America's heartland earlier this month, burning cattle alive. One local called these wildfires our Hurricane Katrina. February's record warmth was made 3 times more likely by human-caused climate change, and that record warmth fueled the drought that set up these fires. Continuing to pose important questions and seeking to answer them using scientific tools and observations, as a scientist, that's what I love doing. But I'm here today because I'm also passionate about communicating what we know to the public and to policymakers. In my view, nothing could be more noble. Anti-science forces have launched a series of bad faith assaults on climate science and climate scientists. I should know I've found myself at the center of these episodes more than once. We've recently seen the latest in this perpetual series of attacks, and the story is eerily familiar. As always, they focused on a particular individual, in this case Tom Karl, who in 2015 led a study published in the premier journal Science that put the final nail in the coffin of the contrarian myth du jour that global warming had supposedly stopped. Never mind that we've now broken all-time records for 3 consecutive years, and various published studies have convincingly demonstrated that human-caused global warming continues unabated. This committee's chairman, Chairman Smith, attacked Karl, aided by contrarian bloggers and the tabloid press. Smith even misrepresented an article I was co-author on, claiming it supported his attacks on Karl and NOAA. While we disagreed over some details, precisely the sort of healthy debate that many in this room would like to pretend doesn't exist in the scientific community, both papers agree that human-caused global warming continues unabated, while natural variations continue as well. While such political theater plays out in Congress, the process of real science plays out in the peer-reviewed literature and at scientific meetings where scientists continuously challenge each other's findings. But just as our critics have intentionally ignored the many independent studies reaffirming the hockey stick curve for which I was attacked, so too have Karl's critics ignored the fact that his findings have been confirmed by the Berkeley Earth Project, a project funded by the Koch brothers. When I was attacked by Joe Barton a decade ago over the hockey stick, I found support from moderate pro-science Republicans like John McCain and Sherwood Boehlert, the former chair of this committee, I would add. I am deeply appreciative of the efforts today by Republicans like Bob Inglis of South Carolina and former Reagan administration officials James Baker and George Shultz to promote conservative climate solutions. It is time for other Republicans to put aside the anti-science and engage instead in the worthy debate to be had about how we solve this great challenge to all of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mann and Dr. Pielke.
Thank you. I started my career in science and policy working for Chairman George Brown, who's in the red sweater to my left looking down on us, at this committee 26 years ago. It's always a privilege to come back, and I know how hard the members and the staff work on all our behalf. My testimony focuses on how members of Congress can better support scientific integrity in climate research. Let me tell you a story. Several months after I testified before this committee in December 2013, the White House posted on its website a 6-page essay by the President's science advisor, which claimed falsely that my testimony before this committee was not representative of mainstream views and was seriously misleading. Now, we've all come to learn that no good happens when the White House releases false information, and my case was no different. 1 year later, Congressman Raul Grijalva opened a formal investigation of me and 6 other professors, 3 of whom are testifying here today. In his letter to my university's president, Mr. Grijalva justified the investigation of me by relying on the science advisor's false claims. In his letter, he introduced another false implication, that I and the other academics had potential conflicts of interest and failures to disclose corporate funding sources. He cited ExxonMobil and the Koch foundations as possible sources of undisclosed funding that I might have received. My university conducted the investigation. And no surprise to me, found I've never received any fossil fuel or Koch Foundation funding. In 2016, the University of Colorado's elected Board of Regents issued a unanimous bipartisan statement in support of me and academic freedom more generally. Despite being ultimately vindicated about the integrity of my research and my funding sources, as well as receiving the strong support of my university leadership, the investigation proved extremely harmful to my ability to work in the field of climate. Yet scientific evidence in support of the conclusions I presented to this committee in 2013 is stronger today. There's little scientific basis in support of claims that extreme weather events, and specifically hurricanes, floods, drought, and tornadoes, and their economic damage, has increased in recent decades due to the emission of greenhouse gases. In fact, since 2013, when I last appeared here, the world and the United States have had a remarkable stretch of good fortune with respect to extreme weather as compared to the past. The lack of evidence to support claims of increasing frequency or intensity of hurricanes, floods, drought, or tornadoes on climate timescales is also supported by the most recent assessments of the IPCC and the broader peer-reviewed literature on which the IPCC is based. My experience as an inconvenient academic is not unique. Politicians, including elected officials in Congress, and enthusiastic advocates from both sides of the aisle have targeted climate researchers whose peer-reviewed research they do not like, including all 4 witnesses testifying here today. Such dynamics of delegitimization are not unique to the climate issue. Drawing on my experiences, my research, and that of the broader community focused on science advice, I offer several recommendations focused on how members of Congress can improve the state of science integrity in climate science. Policymakers and scientists have developed well-established processes for assessing the state of scientific knowledge on subjects of relevance. Such processes include federal advisory committees, those of the national academies, the assessments of the IPCC, and many others nationally and internationally. Such processes work best when they are populated by a diversity of experts, including those who may hold minority or even unpopular perspectives. Members of Congress have the standing and authority to call for such assessments to ensure through oversight that they are conducted with integrity and responsive to their information requests. In contrast, while the legislative process can be extremely effective in highlighting partisan differences on policy, it is not well suited to provide an accurate characterization of the state of scientific understandings. Sometimes debates over science serve as a proxy for debates about policy preferences or political orientation. When members of Congress and scientists participate in such proxy debates, it contributes to the pathological politicization of science. Oversight of the integrity of scientific assessments is an important and appropriate role for congressional committees. However, the investigation of individual researchers is not an appropriate role for Congress and is unlikely to contribute positively to the upholding of scientific integrity. A bipartisan truce ending such investigations of individual researchers should start immediately. Congress should support the role of scientific assessments in providing an accurate perspective on questions asked by policymakers. We have plenty of knowledge and experience about how to arrive at accurate representations of the state of scientific understandings on any topic. It's a choice whether or not to use that knowledge and experience. Thanks again for the opportunity to share these views.
Thank you, Dr. Pielke, and I'll recognize myself for questions, and let me address my first question to Dr. Curry. And Dr. Curry, let me say at the outset, I know you could take an hour to answer this question. Unfortunately, you'll have to give me a summary. And the question is this: what are the uncertainties, complexities, biases involved with climate science or the study of climate science that need to be considered before we can actually make informed decisions about what to do about climate science?
Well, the greatest uncertainties in both our understanding and our ability to model the climate system relate to these items. The first is what I call the thermodynamic feedbacks related to clouds and water vapor. Climate models have a large amplifying effect from clouds and water vapor. The magnitude of this amplifying effect and even the sign are in dispute. A lot about the oceans that we don't understand, how the ocean transports heat and carbon in the vertical is not well represented in the climate models. We also have these very large-scale, long-term ocean oscillations, which play a huge role in determining our climate. These are not well simulated, and we don't have good documentation of the really long time period oscillations. The effects of the sun on climate, particularly the indirect solar effects. And I could go on, but I think those are the key issues.
And you didn't even get into the biases and other uncertainties, but that's a good start, and that gives us an idea. Thank you, Dr. Curry. Dr. Christy, the PowerPoints you put up on the flat screens a while ago, I thought were absolutely riveting and, at least to me, very persuasive. My question is, why are both the satellite and surface temperature measurements so far below the climate model predictions? In other words, there's a conflict between the data and the predictions. Why is that?
Well, there are a lot of answers, I suppose. I can speculate about some. What we've seen is that the models tend to be too sensitive to greenhouse gases, likely related to the fact the models tend to shrink clouds more than in reality, so that more sunlight gets in and heats up the Earth more. So that's one idea that may be the reason, but overall the basic answer is the models are too sensitive to extra greenhouse gases. The Earth has a way to release the heat that greenhouse gases try to build up.
I think most instructive was the line that showed the actual observations as opposed to the modeling and how big of a discrepancy there was between the two. Thank you for pointing that out. Dr. Pielke, you, in your testimony today, mentioned that extreme weather events are not necessarily caused by climate change. In fact, the IPCC has said there's low confidence that there's any connection between climate change and extreme weather events. Why are some climate scientists claiming that there's a connection when you and other scientists in the IPCC all says there's likely not a connection?
Yeah, when you talk about trends in extreme events, it's really important to focus on the phenomena. You're talking about hurricanes, floods, drought, and look at those individually. It's long been a puzzle to me why there would be any controversy over this topic, since something like a hurricane is pretty big. It's easy to see when it occurs. We have very good data on it. In the United States, a number of hurricanes and the intensity of hurricanes is down by 20% since 1900. I don't put a lot of stock into that because you can start at different dates and get different trends, but the point is there's no evidence to suggest that hurricanes, either in the U.S. or globally, are increasing, and the same goes for floods, drought, and tornado. And don't believe me, you can look at the appendix that I provided with data from the IPCC. So why people would hang their hat on long-term trends in extreme weather is a puzzle.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pielke. That concludes my questions, and the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, is recognized for hers.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We have seen some congressional Republicans be critical of individual scientists because of the scientists' research does not align with their personal and political beliefs. Dr. Mann, what kind of effect does criticism of this type have on an individual scientist, research institutions, or even the entire fields of research?
I think the attacks against scientists by individuals, groups, many of them allied with fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel front groups, are aimed at several goals. One of them is to silence climate scientists. If you get attacked every time you publish an article that demonstrates the reality and threat of human-caused climate change, if that causes you to become subject to congressional inquiries and Freedom of Information Act requests, obviously that's very stifling. And I think the intention is to cause scientists to retreat. I also think that the intention of these very public attacks on climate scientists, like Tom Karl, is meant to send a chilling signal to the entire research community, that if you too publish and speak out about the threat of human-caused climate change, we're going to come after you too. Science and the progress of science that we have relied upon as a nation for our prosperity, science relies on the ability of researchers to carry out unfettered investigations into the natural world. And any time you start trying to game that system, it becomes very problematic. I would like to speak to one example from history. This is the example of Trofim Lysenko, was a Russian agronomist, and it became Leninist doctrine to impose his views about heredity, which were crackpot theories, completely at odds with the world's scientists. Under Stalin, rather, scientists were being jailed if they disagreed with his theories about agriculture, and Russian agriculture actually suffered. Scientists were jailed, they died in their jail cells, and potentially millions of people suffered from the disastrous agricultural policies that followed from that. So that's what happens when fringe scientific views that might support a particular ideology are allowed to trump actual mainstream science.
Thank you. How do we make sure that political influence does not negatively influence the scientific process?
Say that again, please.
How can we make sure that political influence does not negatively influence the scientific process?
Well, you know, I agree with Roger Pielke Jr. That we have to discourage investigations that are aimed at discrediting and threatening individual climate scientists about their research. Now, asking for a scientist's source of funding, to me, is fair game, and I'm always more than happy to provide details about where my funding comes from. I think any scientist should be willing to do that, and Congress has a right to know that information as well. But going after scientists simply because you don't like the implications of their research, not because their science is bad, but because you find the implications of their research inconvenient to the special interests who fund your campaigns, I would hope we could all agree that that is completely inappropriate. It's a threat to science. It's a threat to our prosperity as a nation, which relies on scientific research, unfettered, honest scientific research.
Thank you. Very quickly. Dr. Pielke has accused you and other climate researchers of being bullies toward individuals who don't agree with you. Have you been a target of personal attacks based on your research?
Well, I have, as I've just mentioned, the hockey stick graph became a focus of attacks by congressional Republicans like Congressman Joe Barton, Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia. Of course, our research ultimately has been validated time and again, and yet the attacks continue because it was an iconic research result. But I would like, and it spoke to the obvious fact that our globe is warming, and it's due to human activity. But I would like to speak to this other point you raised about Dr. Pielke and others accusing climate scientists like myself of being bullies. I do think that's rather rich coming from Roger. He does have a history of bullying other scientists who criticize him and then sort of pointing to himself as the victim. 3 years ago, he wrote a piece for Nate Silver's new 538 website that rejected the connection between climate change and extreme weather. Keep in mind, Roger isn't an actual climate scientist. A number of actual climate scientists, including Kevin Trenberth, who was a distinguished researcher at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, publicly challenged his statements in his article, and was the subject, along with me, of threatening emails from Roger. In fact, Kevin Trenberth's boss received a threatening email that implied potential legal action if he didn't apologize and retract his criticisms. Well, the emails were reviewed by 538, by Nate Silver, and he decided that they were not in keeping with the values of the organization. He terminated Roger's involvement with 538. Roger then presented himself as the victim. And so in this case, clearly Roger was the bully, sending these bullying emails to me and Kevin Trenberth and our bosses, and then trying to paint himself as the victim. And that just doesn't serve the discourse.
The gentleman's
Thank you
time
very
has
much.
expired. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As an overview, so many questions, so little time. I'm going to direct my question to Dr. Christy from my hometown at University of Alabama in Huntsville. But if anyone else wants to add any comments, please feel free. When I say so many questions, first we've got the issue of whether global warming exists, and if so, to what degree, and if so, is it cyclical or man-made? But we've also got the question about if it is non-cyclical, if it is man-made, what are the effects? And in that vein, I'd like to get your insight on some information that I received while I was in Antarctica about 15 or 16 months ago. The question focuses on sea level rise or fall. What we generally see in the news media is if there's global warming, and it makes sense at first blush, well, you're going to see ice melt and you're going to see the sea levels rise, and we're going to have all sorts of damage done to our coastal areas as a consequence. But while I was in Antarctica, I met with a number of national science foundations who all contended that there was some degree of global warming, but they added that if there was a slight or modest global warming, that the sea levels will fall, not rise. Let me emphasize that the sea levels, if there is slight or modest global warming, will fall, not rise. And of course, that was somewhat perplexing because that's the exact opposite of what we hear in the news media on a regular basis. And this is what they said. And Dr. Christy, if you'd please share your insight as to whether you think their argument is legitimate or not. First, that the principal amount of ice on the planet is in Antarctica, roughly 85% more or less of the total amount of ice on the planet. Second, that if their temperatures rise a little bit, then that air is going to carry more moisture, which in Antarctica is going to be deposited on a huge landmass that is larger than the size of the United States of America. By way of example, some levels of ice, I think the mean is around 6,000 feet deep. South Pole, it's more than that. In some places in Antarctica, it's as much as 3 miles thick. And that it takes hundreds of years for that ice that has fallen in Antarctica to actually reach the coastline, which means that if temperature goes up a little bit because of this effect, you're actually looking at more snow and ice being deposited on Antarctica and water being taken from the oceans, more than offsetting whatever melt there may be in Greenland or the Arctic. So what are your thoughts on that theory or argument that they were raising to us in Antarctica?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I will yield to our polar expert here, Dr. Curry, for the answer.
Well, dadgummit, I wanted to do something with a local boy, but go ahead, Dr. Curry.
It's pretty hot in Alabama.
All right, thank you, John. Well, the mass balance of glaciers is a complicated topic, and we have, new satellite technologies that are trying to measure this, from laser altimetry and so on and so forth. But you see glacier accumulation in some regions due to increased snowfall, and then there's a few regions where you see it melting. And this is true both for Greenland and Antarctica. The idea of warmer oceans translating into more snowfall seems to be a real one, but then there's glacier dynamics. It's a very complex situation. So there is something to what you heard, that is a real mechanism, but how all this plays out for the glacier mass balance remains a topic of research, and it's really only, the last decade or so that we have had really, really good measurements of glacier topography, and we can really track the mass balance. So we do need the observations from satellite and also field experiments to sort out this issue.
Well, moving to a NASA study from 1992 to 2008, they concluded that in Antarctica you were seeing, while there's this global warming going on, a net addition of about 100 billion tons of ice per year. And you talk about over the last decade. Is that 1992 to 2008 data accurate in your judgment or inaccurate?
There's uncertainty, but you're seeing the accumulation over East Antarctic, whereas on the West Antarctic ice shelves, you're seeing net melting. So there's some spatial variability. And there is significant uncertainties in our estimates of all this, particularly the further back you go.
Anybody else want to add any comments to that issue? Dr. Mann?
Yeah, so we have widespread measurements now from satellites, direct measurements of the total ice mass contained in the ice sheets. And there is no question that the two main potential contributors to global sea level rise, the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet, are losing ice. And we know that that loss of ice means that the ice sheets are contributing to sea level rise already. Now, we hear so much about uncertainty, as if uncertainty is a reason for inaction. But in this case, the uncertainties are breaking against us because we are actually seeing more rapid loss of ice from those ice sheets than the climate models that many here criticize had predicted in the past. That means that we are going to see more sea level rise in the near term than the models had predicted. In this case, uncertainty is not our friend. It's breaking against us.
Dr. Mann, Dr. Curry, thank you. Dr. Christy, next time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There have been many studies that have confirmed that of the thousands of peer-reviewed papers that have taken a position on the cause of global warming, 97% recognize the influence humans have on global warming, and only 3% reject or minimize the connection between humans and climate change. So the witness panel does not really represent the vast majority of climate scientists who have concluded that there is a connection between human activity and climate change. So sort of visualize 96 more climate scientists who agree that climate change is driven by human activity. I know we don't have that many seats at the dais, but I just want to put that out there for a balanced panel. We need 96 more Dr. Manns. So we know that human contributions to climate change have vast and alarming effects, including rising sea levels, ocean acidification, melting glaciers. We just got the alarming report recently about the Great Barrier Reef. Climate change is damaging our environment, our economy, our food sources, and fossil fuel emissions also contribute to higher rates of asthma, lung and heart disease, threatening the lives of our children and grandchildren. So I'm proud to say that my home state of Oregon is taking action. In January of 2016, the Nature Conservancy convened the Oregon Business Leaders Greenhouse Gas Emission Task Force. And it's a coalition of business leaders who recently produced a report with strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and at the same time maintain our business competitiveness. The action items include calling for Oregon building codes to promote energy efficiency, increasing federal investment in low carbon technologies, addressing congestion in the metropolitan areas, and I applaud the Nature Conservancy and our business leaders in Oregon for rising to the challenge and coming up with common sense solutions that benefit the environment and also help our businesses succeed in a changing world. We understand that it is not mutually exclusive, that we can protect the environment and grow our economy. So, Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter the Nature Conservancy report into the record.
No, without objection.
Dr. Mann, science continues to prove the connection between human activity and our changing climate. So instead of holding this unproductive hearing, what would be better for this committee to do? How could we further scientific inquiry and investigate actions that we could take to respond to the current and future risks of climate change?
Well, thanks very much for the question. And as I often like to say, actually science doesn't prove anything. Proof is for mathematical theorems and alcoholic beverages. But what science does do is establish at high levels of confidence, just like the theory of gravity. We haven't proved it, but we don't jump off a cliff. we understand that it's real. And the same thing is true with climate change. In fact, by some measures, there is as deep a consensus about human-caused climate change as there is about gravity. It literally goes back 2 centuries to Joseph Fourier in the early 1800s. So as I've said before, what I would like to see, what I would hope we would see in Congress is a good faith debate between politicians on both sides of the aisle advocating for solutions to this problem that are consistent with their ideologies. And I think it's great that there are Republicans and conservatives today who are out there saying to their fellow Republicans, let's put aside the anti-science. This is about U.S. competitiveness. The rest of the world is moving ahead. They're transitioning to renewable energy. They're actually tackling this problem, and we stand to get left behind.
Thank you. I'm going to get another question. I did want to note that Mr. Pielke's testimony indicates he might support a carbon tax. I wish we were having a hearing about that. So we've also heard in the committee and elsewhere in Congress criticisms of the climate models used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the IPCC, and other bodies that understand and discuss responses to climate change. So there have been some, like Dr. Christy, who claim that the satellite data somehow disproves our understanding of climate change. So would you respond to that claim, and how should we consider the value of satellite and InSight observations as we work to better understanding our Earth's climate?
Well, thanks for the question. And I would say that, that statement that the satellite data somehow disprove human-caused climate change, it's what I call an RUS. It's a ridiculously untrue statement. And the surface and near-surface temperature records, in fact, if we can show Exhibit A from my written statement here, shows that all of the surface and near-surface temperature records agree that there's a steady long-term pattern of warming. That's true for the temperatures measured by thermometers at the surface, the balloon measurements in the lower atmosphere, and both John's satellite data set and other estimates from the same satellite data. Now, I should point out that that's John's satellite data set after it's been corrected for numerous errors that he had made over the years, and which came to light because of other attempts by other researchers to reproduce his results. And ultimately now, with those corrections, his satellite record is basically consistent with these other records. They all show long-term warming, and I would add, by the way, that if he is right, that the mid and upper troposphere are not warming as fast as the models say. And there's a paper just out a week ago by Ben Santer, Susan Solomon, Presidential Medal of Science winner, a very austere team of climate scientists that has shown that his claim of the observations not showing the model predicted warming in the mid and upper troposphere is largely an artifact of the fact that he's mixing in stratospheric temperatures. The stratosphere actually cools. In global warming, the lower part of the atmosphere, including where we live, the troposphere warms, the stratosphere cools. His satellite estimates actually smear some of that cooling stratosphere into what he's calling the upper troposphere, and that's the reason for the discrepancy. And if he was right that it was warming less quickly than the models predict, it would actually imply the opposite of what he claimed earlier. It would imply a higher climate sensitivity, because it turns out that one of the negative, what we call the negative feedbacks, one of the ameliorating effects, the so-called lapse rate feedback, would not be as strong as we think it is. So it would actually mean that the climate is even more sensitive to increasing greenhouse gas concentrations.
Thank you, Dr.
Opposite.
Mann.
Has
I'm
expired.
out of time. Yield back.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, is recognized for his questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I'll go back to you in this ping pong ball discussion, Dr. Christy. It was very interesting. Would you like to respond to Dr. Mann's explanation of your
absolutely. What he
quote
said was
anti-science?
incorrect. The satellites, balloons, and reanalyses, 10 different measuring systems show the same thing, all include the stratospheric portion, which is very tiny in the tropics. The models included it as well. And so it was an apples-to-apples comparison. What I showed was a legitimate scientific test. And I would just like to say one other thing. Science is not done by polling. It's done by numbers. And I showed numbers that can stand up under cross-examination. Those are the numbers that are out there, and that we see the climate models do fail when compared against real data.
And Dr. Christy, continuing with you, we've heard referred to any, basically, if you don't toe to the consensus view on climate here, that you're practicing anti-science. I was wondering what your comment would be on that.
I would just say I don't practice anti-science, and people can say what. It's something you should understand. Scientists are people, and they say crazy things all the time. They are people and human.
Sounds like Congress is really what it sounds like there. Well, this hearing is really focusing on scientific method, and some of our recent discourse might have gotten a little bit away from strictly scientific method, but a lot of research on climate change receives significant funding from governments, and by extension, that means the American taxpayer. So my next questions are focusing on us really trying to get at funding and how it might impact outcomes in research and potential biases. So the Congressional Research Service has estimated that between 2008 and 2013, the United States government spent $77 billion on climate change. And it's my understanding that the Government Accountability Office is also working on a similar in-depth report. So I'll go with you, Dr. Curry. Are there concerns that climate change funding across many federal agencies may be duplicative or even sometimes wasteful?
Well, I think that the funding for observing systems, particularly satellite observing systems, is money very, very well spent. Also for our ocean observing systems. I mean, this is critical information that we need, and I urge you to support continued funding of these. My concern is that too many announcements of opportunity from funding agents, implicitly assume that climate change is caused by humans and that it's dangerous. And as a result, what we get is what a lot of research that I would call climate model taxonomy, where scientists just analyze the output of the IPCC production runs and make claims that climate change causes syphilis or will stop growing grapes in California or whatever. You've seen all these claims. And these are not useful studies. What we need is more fundamental climate dynamics research to understand how the climate system works on decadal to century time scales, and use this understanding to develop new structural forms for our climate models. That's what I think we need to do to move all this forward.
And Dr. Pielke, is there any way to determine how much of the funding that we see going to support this, what has been called the consensus of science, or those who question the consensus, or perhaps might be skeptical anyway? Is there any way to track that?
Well, let me say at the outset that the findings related to climate science have been largely consistent since the 1980s. Yeah, there's a lot of details, but there is fundamental risk. It's not going away, and there are fundamental legitimate disagreements, as you heard here. What has happened in climate science is that this idea of a 97% consensus went from characterizing what the research looked like to characterizing what views were legitimately allowed to be aired. The fact that a scientist as distinguished as John Christy is excoriated in the media by politicians on social media on a daily basis for doing legitimate science tells us something about the pressures to conform to a particular point of view. But let me say, you can fund billions and billions of dollars more climate research, and the findings will be very much the same. There's fundamental risks, the future is uncertain, and we have choices about whether and how we might want to mitigate those risks.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. The gentleman from California, Dr. Baer, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a lot of people have talked about the scientific method. And yeah, I am a scientist. I'm a doctor. I've spent a lot of time in the lab, a lot of time doing research. And as a physician, how I interpret the scientific method is to discover cause and effect relationships by asking questions, gathering and examining the evidence, and seeing if all the available information can bring you to a logical conclusion. So let's do that. Let's actually go through the scientific method here and gather information. The temperature is rising. Dr. Mann, what was the hottest year on record? 2016. Second, 2015. Third, 2014. Fourth, 2010. So we see this trend. Even Dr. Christie's graphs show, while there's variation, show a trend line of warming temperature. Dr. Mann, is the polar ice melting?
Yes.
Does ice melt when it gets colder or hotter? Great. I'm a simple.
Pretty sure about that one, yeah.
Exactly. So, and is ocean temperature rising?
Equally sure about that one.
Okay, so we've gathered the facts. Now let's start to think about, okay, what's causing this? So we can agree that we ought to move the conversation towards what's causing it. And even Dr. Pielke, you said we can talk about how we mitigate those causes. Yes, no one's going to disagree there's variation in weather patterns. In my home state of California, we've gone through dramatic droughts in the past few years. Not this year, though. We're having one of the, if not the wettest year on record, one of the wettest years on record. So there is variation. But that doesn't mean we ought not to be thinking about what's causing this and move the conversation. And we ought not to, whether you deny the climate's changing or deny that the Earth is getting hotter, or you agree with that, as the vast majority of scientists do, we ought not to be persecuting our scientists. We ought to be having an open dialogue, and there's no problem with varying opinions, but we ought to have an honest conversation about it. Do any of you think do any of you disagree with the fact that the Earth rotates around the sun? Pretty given science. But in 1633, Galileo was persecuted for putting forth that theory. Again, let's not go back to that time. Let's actually move this conversation forward. This is the Science and Technology Committee. Let's have an honest conversation about what's happening. We all agree the Earth is warming. We all agree that we're seeing more extremes of climate. Let's start mitigating that. Again, you could argue whether humans are causing this or if it's natural. I seem to think, there's a human cause of this. So, Dr. Mann, where would you proceed if you were to, again, advise this committee?
Well, let me first say, the scientific method, we've heard this term quite a bit. The chairman keeps using this term. I do not think it means what he thinks it means. According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers funded outlet that has a climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that
Well,
conference.
let me finish my...
No, they do not say that they are deniers, and you should not say that they are either.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let
Well,
me finish my
be
statement.
accurate in your description. That's
I stand by my
all I'm
statement,
asking.
but can I finish my point?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to Science, and I'm quoting from them, he sees his role on this committee as a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets when it comes to
And who are they
science.
quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to committee the article.
That is not known as an objective writer or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine.
Yeah,
If that's not objective.
I'd like to reclaim my
And
time.
the gentleman from California reclaims his time.
Great. Dr. Mann, if you could submit that paper to me.
Absolutely.
We'd love to submit that for the record.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. So just to continue, so science involves an objective search for truth, and that's what scientists do, and we challenge each other. It's not the love fest that some would like to make it sound like. My good friend who's no longer with us, Steve Schneider, used to characterize climate or science in general as a contact sport, because scientists are constantly contesting in the peer-reviewed literature at meetings. The way you get ahead in science isn't by saying, yes, I agree with everything, I agree with all the others. The way you get an article in the journals Nature and Science is by showing something different, something new. And so that's the self-correcting machinery that keeps science, using the language of Carl Sagan, that keeps science on a path towards truth. What we stand to be in danger of here is to have that machinery basically destroyed by the politicization of science.
I couldn't agree with you more. So let's not persecute our scientists. We can disagree, we can have robust debate, but let's actually have an honest, robust debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bear. And with that objection, I'd like to enter into the record 3 articles on the so-called 97% consensus, which shows that there was no consensus. The 97% was derived from a small sample of a small sample, and the question wasn't whether humans contributed most of the change in climate, but whether they contributed any part at all. The surprise is it's not more than 97%. Anyway, the 97% figure has been misused today a number of times, and without objection, those articles are made a part of the record. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Mann, are you affiliated or associated with an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists?
No, I
You're
correspond
not
with-
affiliated nor associated with them.
Am I associated with
All right,
them? I
sir.
know people
Are you,
who are
Are you
with
affiliated or
UCS.
associated with an organization called the Climate Accountability Institute?
No, I mean, I may
You're not affiliated nor associated with them.
I can provide you, I've submitted my CV. You can see who I'm associated
These
with.
two
who I'm not.
organizations, are they connected directly with organized efforts to prosecute man-influenced climate skeptics via RICO statutes?
The way you've phrased it, I would find it extremely surprising if what you said was true.
Dr. Pielke, I'm going to ask you a series of short questions, please. Are hurricanes increasing?
Depends on what date you want to start, but on climate timescales in the United States and globally, no.
Are tornadoes increasing?
There's a lot of uncertainty about tornadoes, but there's no evidence to suggest that they've been increasing.
Are floods increasing?
As the IPCC concluded, there's not really good data worldwide to know if they're going up or down.
Are droughts increasing?
Globally and in the United States, according to the EPA and according to the IPCC, the answer is no.
Why would you, can you explain why some would say that with such certainty that extreme weather events will increase, given the fact that they have not?
Well, they may increase yet in the future. And there's a number of projections made by the IPCC that suggest that they might. And that's part of the uncertainty associated with science. But looking from the past to today, we have good evidence to be able to answer the question whether these phenomena have increased on climate timescales.
And some scientists have a hypothesis that extreme weather events will increase because of climate change. And how do those scientists, how would you explain they square that hypothesis with the reality that these extreme weather events have not increased?
Yeah, if you look at the IPCC and mainstream science, we shouldn't expect to see the signal of human-caused climate change in increasing extreme events for decades and many decades into the future. So there's often a conflation of what's predicted, say, in 2100 with what we're observing today. And if we're seeing an increase in extreme events today, that would actually show that the models are wrong, because they suggest we won't see it for many decades.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Mann, would you be able to, at some future date, provide to this committee evidence of your lack of association with the organization Union of Concerned Scientists and lack of your association with the organization called Climate Accountability Institute? Can you provide that documentation to this committee, sir?
Yeah, so you haven't defined what association even means here, but it's all in my CV, which has already been provided to committee.
Would you provide a statement
I'll
to
send
this
it again.
committee
Yeah.
regarding your assertion?
I will send it again.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Tunko, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As an engineer, I know a few things about uncertainty. I know, for example, that everything from a steel beam to a parachute has a certain very small probability of failure. We have to account for uncertainty to be able to build large buildings and great structures that last for generations. We do the math, we check out our work, and we test it. We go back over time and shore up any weak spots. And when everyone does their part to build and maintain and test them, these structures remain strong. Science works in a similar way, thriving on the uncertainty that lives between evidence and conclusions. So when a few individuals express doubt about climate change, scientists listen, check their theories against the available data, and continue to observe and improve. But like the failure rate of that steel beam, the uncertainty in climate change science is known and negligible. For every one scientist who disputes the fact that human activity is driving climate change, there are 17,352 who acknowledge human activity is the main driver of climate change. So if we have a handful of scientists here in this room today who are skeptical about the human role in climate change, there are tens of thousands more credible, trained scientists out in the world standing up for the scientific fact that humans are the major driver of climate change. It is notable that those tens of thousands of scientists are represented here solely by Dr. Mann. I want to thank Dr. Mann for being here today and representing this overwhelming consensus. The scientific community thrives on skepticism and uncertainty, but denial is something different. Unlike healthy scientific skepticism, climate change denial stands today as one of the great pillars in the pantheon of political manipulation. Decades ago, major players in the fossil fuel industry saw the issue of climate change gaining popular attention. They also realized that any serious effort to reduce carbon pollution and greenhouse gases could be a death blow for their industry. So instead of embracing the clear evidence in front of them that fossil fuels contribute to climate change, they launched one of the most successful misinformation campaigns in our American history, right up there with the tobacco industry lying about cancer risks. In 1998, the fossil fuel industry laid out its misinformation strategy and tactics in something they called the Global Climate Science Communications Action Plan. Mr. Chair, I ask to enter this document into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This action plan said, and I quote, "Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Media understands, recognizes uncertainties in climate science." The plan also called for identifying, recruiting, and training a team of independent scientists to participate in media outreach. Their cause was not to better science or public education. It was to undermine the ability of science to inform our public and private decisions. The plan was devised by 12 people from the oil and gas industry, along with communication strategists, PR professionals. One of those individuals was Myron Ebell, whose name has recently surfaced again because he led President Trump's transition team at the EPA. And it seems certain from EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt's recent actions that he will be more interested in strategic communications and parlor tricks to distract the public from the reality of climate change than actually attempting to address these serious problems. So, Dr. Mann, a question. Can you talk a little bit about how you see these sort of tactics and distractive techniques being played out in the discussions about climate change, please?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. Indeed, we do see these attacks against climate scientists orchestrated in many cases by organizations and individuals tied to fossil fuel interests. You mentioned specifically Scott Pruitt. And of course, Scott Pruitt is on record saying that this is his quote, "I would not agree that human activity is a primary contributor to the global warming that we see, which is completely at odds with what the world scientists have determined." Now, what is particularly concerning to me is that one of our witnesses here today, Judith Curry, supported that statement. She said, "I do not find anything to disagree with in what he said," which means that she is clearly going against what the U.S. National Academy of Sciences has said, what every academic, scientific organization in the U.S. that has weighed in on the matter has said, and I find that distressing. Now, to have an EPA administrator who has that, such a position that's so at odds with the scientific evidence, there is no precedent, even in past Republican administrations, under Nixon, under Reagan, under George H.W. Bush. They each had EPA administrators that embraced science, and actually that's where market-driven solutions to dealing with environmental problems came about. Nixon founded the EPA. George H.W. Bush, under his wonderful EPA administrator, William K. Riley, signed the passed cap and trade legislation. Remember cap and trade that came from the Bush administration as a market-driven mechanism, mechanism for dealing with an environmental problem. So what we have today with an EPA administrator who rejects the overwhelming opinion of the world's scientists is completely at odds with what we have ever seen before in both Democratic and Republican administrations.
Dr. Mann, thank you so much, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett. Who is up next? The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
Yes, I'd like to thank the chairman for calling this hearing today because it exposes people to different ideas, and it exposes people, and especially at a time when those who disagree with the mainstream are being brutalized into silence. This type of hearing is vital to hear the fundamental arguments. Unfortunately, from get-go, we have heard personal attack after personal attack after personal attack coming from those who are claiming to represent the mainstream of science, even to the point that our chairman is attacked with a non-quote, with an analysis of somebody else's interpretation of what he said, and we have our chairman attacked like that. That is ridiculous. People, you should be ashamed of yourselves for people who continue to attack other people because they disagree. You can call people deniers all you want. You can use every kind of name you want. You're not standing up to the consensus. When we talk about how Mr. Lysenko was promoted by Stalin, that's the type of thing they did to the scientist in Russia. Because you don't agree with Mr. Lysenko, and now you can bet nobody except those who agree with Lysenko are going to be able to get a government research contract in Russia, the same as we've heard here in the United States from scientists who have great credentials who aren't able to get who haven't been able to get research grants because they're now labeled deniers and attacked personally. This is a disgrace to the scientific community. And let me just go into some thing here. Now, CO2, the theory of CO2 changing the temperature of the climate, that is what basically we're talking about when we talk about man-made climate change. That's the theory. It's not whether or not we've cut down the forest in order to produce farmland, et cetera. It's CO2 production. That's what they're talking about when they're proposing United Nations restrictions on our activities based on that theory, because the globe is going to be affected by it. Now, was there a pause or wasn't there a pause in the increase of temperature of the climate at a time when there was massive increases in CO2? That seems to be a fundamental question of whether or not, now, the fact that today the pause is, it should be evident that at one point, at least those people who are attacking the side admitted that there was a pause. And you can tell that by the very discussion. That is, we remember when the issue was global warming. We remember over and over again, global warming. And now, well, just some spirit of some evolution that now we call it climate change. Well, what that is a recognition is there was a pause in the heating of the planet, even by those people who are advocating the opposite now. That's why they call it climate change. Every time you call it climate change, you are admitting that, yes, there was a pause, a major pause in temperature increase, because before that, it was global warming. Over and over and over again, we heard that global warming. Let me ask Ms. Curry, you in particular, your testimony today was, I think, perhaps the most important testimony. And that is from someone who felt that she had to go along with the consensus and ignore facts that would then lead to an honest conclusion. Could you give me a reaction to what I just said in terms of of the way you're being treated?
Well, the issue, okay, what advocacy groups say, what the media say, what anonymous bloggers say, it's noise. But what I'm concerned about is the behavior of scientists. And, I've been called a denier for the congressional record from Michael Mann's testimony. Judith Curry, the denier, is now in the congressional record. What kind of a behavior is that? This is not the behavior of scientists who are respectfully disagreeing and open to debate. I mean, I am not out there in the fringes. My main point is that I think there are a lot of uncertainties and that the climate models and the data, et cetera, are not fit for the purpose for drawing highly confident conclusions about what has been causing the recent warming. It's been warming for hundreds of years. And we can't explain all of that, due to human causes. So I'm saying we need to think more broadly about this problem. And that's what I'm saying.
Right.
And I get called a denier and who knows what else.
Well, we've seen cycles. There have been cycles throughout the history of the planet of warming and cooling cycles. Whether or not man's use of CO2 is now creating a warming cycle is what this is all about. And for scientists on either side to try to call names and try to beat somebody into submission, that's a Stalinist tactic. Those using the words denier are using a Stalinist tactic. And it is just incredible for me to hear others trying to claim that what the basis of their discussion is what all scientists and the rest of everybody else who disagrees is in some way not worthy of being called a scientist. They're deniers. Mr. Chairman, I want to place for the record very quickly 300 names of 300 major scientists given to, who signed on to a letter by, of course, the head of the science, Dr. Lindzen from MIT, asking us to get out of the Convention for Climate Change.
Without objection,
and
so ordered.
300 prominent scientists. I'd like to also put for the record a in-depth study by a professor, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Niels Alex Morner, talking about sea level, a man who has spent a massive amount of time studying sea level rise and shows that what we are getting is bogus
Without objection, that'll be
information.
made a part of the record as well.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Rohrabacher.
Chairman.
And the gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for unanimous consent as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My research has clarified that the organization called the Climate Accountability Institute is the primary organization calling for criminal prosecution of climate skeptics under RICO statutes. I'd like entered into the record, sir, from their website, from the Climate Accountability website, listed as one of the Climate Accountability Institute Council of Advisors, Mr. Michael E. Mann. I would like this entered to the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. The gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, did he return? Okay. I am sorry. Ms. McNerney has returned, and he was ahead of you. Okay. Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized for
I didn't know I was going to be so controversial here, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
And I want to thank my friend from California for his opinion on this issue, Mr. Rohrabacher. Thank you. Mr. Mann, Dr. Mann, I'm looking at the Exhibit B, and I was hoping that this could be brought to the screen. And it's the so-called hockey curve. Now, what interests me about this is the way this shaded area diminishes over time. Could you explain that a little bit, how the shaded blue area diminishes as we get closer to the current day?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you're showing that plot here, because one thing it shows, our hockey stick curve, that's the blue curve that was published nearly 2 decades ago, along with its uncertainties, the blue shading, You'll notice it's nearly identical to that green curve. That green curve is from a team of 78 scientists who published in the premier journal Nature Geoscience a few years ago, using the most widespread database of proxy data ever brought to bear on a problem like this. And they got virtually an identical result to the one we had published decades ago. So to those who claim that the hockey stick has been discredited, just the opposite is true. The reason it's accepted is because other scientists using different methods, different data, coming at the problem from different angles, have all come up with the same result.
And you could
That's
say
how
that
science works.
That's consistent with the scientific method.
Exactly. That's how science works. If your result is wrong, it's going to be discovered pretty quickly, and that's what happened with John's satellite records, which he originally claimed showed cooling. Ultimately, it was discovered that there was an algebraic error in their code and a sign error, like a minus where there's supposed to be a plus. And now we have a consensus where John's updated estimates are more or less in keeping with the other estimates. That's how science works. Now you ask, why does the uncertainty become so large back in time? So let me add, by the way, that the word uncertainties appeared in the original article. To those who claim that we are trying to hide uncertainty, that we don't want to talk about uncertainty, the word uncertainties and limitations appeared in the title of this original article, and that's something we focused on. You can see those uncertainties do get quite large as you go back in time because you have less data. You have less paleo data as you go farther back into the past. Now, with some of these newer efforts, like this Page's 2K estimate, the green estimate, they have much more widespread data. The uncertainties are now smaller, and that's how science works. You refine a result, you get a better estimate. Other scientists continually challenge each other, and that's Carl Sagan's self-correcting machinery.
Well, thank you. But why is it so narrow now in the current time, the uncertainty region?
Yeah, because we've got widespread thermometer data over the last century and a half. So as we get more data, the uncertainties get smaller. And the red curve shows the instrumental record. We don't need paleo data to tell us what's happened to temperatures over the past century and a half. We've got widespread thermometer measurements for that.
And these are measurements in the ocean and in the atmosphere and all over the whole planet.
That's right. And to people who say they don't trust the surface temperature record, well, we've got measurements from the ocean surface. We've got measurements of the land for all the continents. We've got the southern hemisphere. We've got the northern hemisphere. They all point in the same direction. We've got lots of independent information from holes in the ground, boreholes, an independent way of estimating surface temperatures back in time. Dozens of independent lines of evidence that all come together telling us the same thing. That's how science works. That's why there's the consensus, not because we're standing around holding hands, because independent teams of scientists coming at the problem from different angles, arriving at the same consistent answer over and over again.
Thank you. In his testimony, Dr. Pielke asserts that since 2013, the world and the United States have had a remarkable stretch of good fortune with respect to extreme weather as compared to the past. Would you respond to that, please?
Yeah, so Roger is pointing to outdated reports, outdated data. 3 years ago, he actually posted the following on his blog. He said, "I am no longer conducting research or academic writing related to climate. I am not available for talks. And on the climate issue, I have no interest in speaking with reporters or giving testimony before Congress." That's what he said back in 2015. Well, that's 3 years ago. There has been a lot of progress over the past 3 years. We just published an article in the journal Scientific Reports a few days ago that reaffirms what scientists are now finding. There are teams of scientists now, whole teams of scientists, when there's an extreme weather event, they can use what's known as detection and attribution. They can actually compare models and observations and estimate how much more likely that event might have been made by human-caused climate change. And in many of the extreme droughts and flooding events that we've seen in recent years, those groups have positively attributed those events. They've said that those events were sufficiently unlikely to have happened without human-caused global warming that we can say at a relatively high level of certainty that climate change did impact that event. Not that it created the event, it made it worse, it made it bigger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a sad day when one of our witnesses lectures us about the number of witnesses we have and how many times that they've been here to testify. It's odd to me that he can remember how many times they've testified. but he cannot remember being associated with the Climate Accountability Institute. That certainly seems to be a convenient lack of memory. So, having said that, I want to go ahead and get to my questions. This will be for you, Dr. Curry, and I'm sorry that you've been demonized and it's been written in the congressional record that you are a climate denier. You shouldn't have to endure that, you know, just because you might have a differing opinion, what we would call a minority report. I don't think that, that you should have to endure that. I also remember, by the way, that if I remember correctly, Mark Twain said that sometimes a majority means all the fools are on one side. So there is that. Dr. Curry, would you characterize any of the climate policies were discussed in the United States, such as major industrial CO2 restrictions, as flexible and adaptive?
No, I'm concerned about, we're facing a problem with characterized by deep uncertainty, and trying to fit this into a command and control kind of solution with climate models, I think is a mismatch to this extremely complex and wicked problem.
So they're not, in your opinion, they're not flexible and adaptive. But science is supposed to be about the ongoing investigation and study and adapting when necessary. Is that correct?
That would certainly be one approach that I think is consistent with the kinds of deep uncertainty we're facing with this problem.
Sure, okay. How about you, Dr. Christy? Would you describe those major industrial CO2 restrictions being discussed as flexible and adaptive?
Well, what I understand is that those regulations are based upon knowing how the system operates, how the climate system operates. One of the fundamental things about science is that when you understand a system, you can predict its behavior. I've demonstrated that the climate models we have now cannot even predict from the past, a major climate metric, the bulk temperature of the atmosphere.
So they're not flexible and adaptive?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so how can you then say, well, this regulation is going to have this consequence? We don't have confidence there.
Dr. Mann, I'll give you a shot at that. Are they flexible and adaptive, those restrictions that we're discussing on CO2?
I'm not sure why you're asking me that question. Obviously,
But because you're a learned scientist and you're here to participate in the discussion.
yeah, that's a matter of policy that you're asking about, and I have tried to be quite clear in my view that there is a worthy debate to be had about what policies we invoke to deal
So
with
now
the
it's
problem.
worthy, and it's not climate deniers.
No, you've misunderstood what I'm saying. There's a worthy debate to be had about the solutions to this problem. There is no longer a worthy debate to be had about whether the problem exists.
That is your opinion.
It's the opinion of the overwhelming community of scientists around the world.
And yet the EPA won't release that data. I'm going to move on to you, Doctor. Is it Pielke? Is that how you say that?
Yes.
In your opinion, you're watching this. This is important to you, I'm sure. Y'all are watching this.
Yeah,
Are the restrictions being discussed flexible and adaptive, in your opinion? You have an opinion.
Yes, I do. I've written a book on climate policy. And regulation has a very important role to play in bringing mature or near mature technologies into deployment. Regulation itself is not a very good tool in stimulating R&D or fundamental innovation to create new technologies. And so if in the absence of energy system innovation, regulations will have marginal effects, but they won't have transformative effects like are being called for with the energy.
So I'll continue with you then to go back the other way. So in your opinion, before we make these kinds of major restrictive regulations, wouldn't we want to be absolutely sure about the data, have the EPA release it, and why in the world would we demonize people who want that? Wouldn't we want transparency from our own government?
Yeah, well, my view, which may not be popular among anyone here, is that scientific uncertainty is not going to be eliminated on this topic before we have to act. If we want to improve energy technology, energy innovation for reasons of competitiveness, for air pollution benefits, for energy access around the world, we have plenty of justification for the U.S. to be a leader. Regulation plays a part in that, but so too does investment in new technologies. To fund that, you guys might think about a low carbon tax, one that's maybe two or three pennies on a gallon of gas, raises hundreds of billions of dollars to bring those new technologies. And if the technologies exist, it'll be a lot easier for you guys to regulate it because it won't have costs that will affect people.
Well, now that he's uttered blasphemy, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I'll yield back.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weber. Back to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Mann, last year, Chairman Smith cited one of your papers in an attempt to contradict the findings of a NOAA study that disproved the theory of a global warming hiatus. In questioning then Administrator Kathy Sullivan, he asked, quote, "Do you still stand by the Carl study's conclusions, or do you now recognize that these conclusions might have been weak and agree with the nature scientist," end quote. Well, Dr. Mann, you are one of those nature scientists, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
By Nature, I mean the Nature magazine. How do you respond?
Yeah, well, I find it unfortunate that our work was misrepresented in that way. Our work in no way challenged the integrity of Tom Carl's work. I have the utmost respect for Tom Carl as a scientist and as a human being, and he has the utmost integrity as a scientist. Our paper expressed an honest scientific difference of opinion. Yes, that's what scientists do. We fight over interpretations and details, precisely the sort of challenges, again, that the critics like to pretend doesn't take place. And in this case, it was a good faith disagreement over how to characterize a long-term warming trend. We weren't disagreeing about whether there's a long-term human-caused warming trend. We were simply contesting the interpretation. Is it sort of a step-like trend like that? Or is it a more wavy trend like that? And what we weren't disagreeing about was that there's a long-term trend and that it's caused by increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. Finally, let me say that other independent scientists, including scientists, I'll say it again, funded by the Koch brothers, have come up with precisely the same result that Tom Carl came up with. And they said that they were able to download online all of the required raw data that was necessary to reproduce his findings. So the claim that he hadn't archived and provided the data necessary for other scientists is just false.
Well, in fact, here I have a letter, actually 2 letters, signed by all 11 of those nature scientists, including one from my own home state of California, rejecting the chairman's interpretation of their work. I would like to have these letters included into the record.
Without objection.
Dr. Mann, I think it's important to take a moment and address those who suggest that those of us who believe and know that climate change is occurring are somehow asking others simply to trust us. Science is not about trust or belief. It is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. Sweeping statements and allegations about climate change and other issues that are not supported by any accepted scientific knowledge or often facts may be the calling card of this new administration. But it is imperative that we not let such irrational rhetoric distract people from understanding how science works. The American people know that our climate is changing, and they understand that we need policies to protect our health and environment. Well, Dr. Mann, is this distinction between trust and understanding important?
It absolutely is. And, you know, when it comes to trust, I trust the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which I might add was founded by a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in the 19th century, to inform Congress about matters of policy-relevant science. And they have weighed in. The world scientists have weighed in. And you know what? It doesn't matter if individual scientists are bad persons. We all have faults as human beings. If our understanding depended on one or a small number of individuals, their opinions, then of course we would not accept these findings as valid. It's the fact that the entire community of climate scientists around the world arguing back and forth in the peer-reviewed literature, contesting each other at meetings, have all from different directions come to the same conclusion, and all of the scientific assessments that have been done, including the U.S. National Academy of Sciences back in the Bush administration, George W. Bush, in his first term, when the IPCC had just published their finding that climate change is real and human-caused, the Bush administration was skeptical about that finding, so they wanted an independent assessment. They asked the U.S. National Academy of Sciences to assess what the IPCC had said. The U.S. National Academy of Science, after independently reviewing the literature and soliciting independent reviewers with a variety of perspectives, came back and said, well, you know, the IPCC, what they said was basically right. Those are the facts, and we can't dispute the facts. And it doesn't matter, you know, the individual personalities of scientists, each of whom are human beings and have their own personal flaws. If that mattered, it would be a problem. The scientific process works because that doesn't matter. Regardless of how good or bad a person you are, your claims will be independently tested by other scientists.
It's
gentleman's
reproducibility,
time has expired.
reproduction, and corroboration by peers.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Before recognizing the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, without objection, I'll put into the record an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal called Keeping Cool About Hot Temperatures, which points out that even though it is claimed that 2016 was the hottest year on record, and 2015 the hottest year on record before that, 2014 the hottest year before that, and all three instances the temperatures were within the margin of error. And that in fact in 2014 NASA admitted that they were only 38% confident of that temperature. That's less than half. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's been very informative. Dr. Curry, I'll ask you. You were a professor at my alma mater, so I did talk to Dr. Peterson here on Monday about some things, so not about climate change. But anyway, I'd like to ask you, what caused the Ice Age?
Well, the the big ice ages, the very big ice ages. Well, it has to do with
I know you weren't there, but
orbital, yeah. The prevailing theory, the so-called Milankovitch theory, that it's related to the orbital variations, changes in the tilt of the Earth's axis, and then there's complex feedbacks with ocean circulations and the carbon cycle. So are we at a point where we have complete predictive understanding of the ice ages? The answer is no. But that's, you know, our current understanding relates to Earth-Sun geometry, long-term deep circulations in the ocean, and the Earth's carbon cycle. All of these things
number one, all of those were natural causes.
Yeah.
Number two, it just proves the point that there is a lot we don't know about what goes on in years, whether it be 40 years or thousands of years or whatever. So when I first ran for office, which was many years ago, long before this issue was an issue, there was another issue, and it was called the coming Ice Age. There's a big article in one of the magazines, I think it was Time magazine, when I was running for office. I read everything. I just wanted to know as much as I could in case some question came up. So I read and read and read. Well, anyway, this article was by this was the standard belief of most scientists at the time in the late 70s. And it talked about the coming Ice Age. So you kind of wonder, we had some charts up there that started in late 79. I don't know, maybe those before that were the other way. And so the only growth in the temperature was a energizing what the temperature used to be before it was cooling. And so it just seems like there is such a short period of time we're looking at this data. It's calculated within, you know, down to maybe 0.4 of a degree. And if we look back thousands of years, there might be a better pattern to see. And granted, we may not have that data, but it seems like we're basing a lot of things on current data, not on necessarily what's happened in the world in general. And we're blaming it on one set of circumstances, which may or may not have been the case for other things that occurred, in that in some cases there weren't any humans.
Well, if you look at the climate of the 20th century, you saw a pretty steep warming trend in the early part of the century up until about 1940, 1945. And this is at a time when there was very little human input of carbon dioxide. And then we saw a cooling trend from the mid-40s to the mid-70s. Okay, and this is what, I guess, triggered concerns about the Ice Age. And then there was a massive reorganization of ocean circulations in the Pacific in the mid-1970s, the so-called, great climate shift. And then we saw increasing temperatures following that. And so trying to sort out what caused the early warming period and then the mid-century cooling period, I've argued that we need to understand this before we have highly confident attribution arguments about the warming since the mid-1970s. So there's a lot of natural variability, largely associated with the multi-decadal and longer ocean oscillations that are not well represented in the climate models. And this is why I've argued for fundamental climate dynamics research to try to better understand this.
So if the scientists of that day, just not too long ago, believed that there was a possibility of a coming ice age, and then all of a sudden it changes, is that, it seems like some of the data is being left out.
Well, that was before we had, in climate, climate modeling, global climate modeling was in its infancy, in the 1970s. So we really didn't have that as a tool to help us understand. But, we understand a lot more now than we did in the 1970s.
But the point is,
Gentleman's
if the scientists of that day, with the amount of information that they had at that time, believed this for a certainty, and now today we believe something for a certainty, we don't know what kind of technology is going to be available 40 years from now.
Yes, the unknown unknowns.
Yeah. So all I can say is, it seems to me like the more I hear, the more I believe that this is an ebb and flow, not necessarily a constant, among even those, if they're the majority of scientists, it's going back and forth, not necessarily staying as a stagnant.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Breyer, is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I'd like to begin just by welcoming a constituent who's shadowing me today, Jairo Medrano, who's a history buff and attending George Washington Middle School in Alexandria. So, Jairo, thank you for being with us. Thank you very much for being to testify. I have this great sense of a food fight among scientists, and I guess each one of you in different ways has talked about what Dr. Curry called was gutter politics. And I apologize for that, and I was trying to think, why can't we all just get along, and realize it's because the stakes are so high. That if the vast majority of scientists are correct about the human impact on global warming, you have 55 million people in Bangladesh that will be displaced, or many countries, including the Maldives, that disappear from the planet. I was just in India with Congressman Esty, and they talked about how climate change there already is dramatically changing agricultural patterns and their ability to feed 1.3 billion people, or the demonstrated increase CDC in lung disease and in tropical diseases here in the United States. Or on a more trivial measure, not for them, the outdoor industries are in a panic about what it's doing to climbing and skiing and hunting and fishing and many, many other things. So there's a lot at stake, which is why this gets so high. I'd like to ask that Dr. Christie's third slide be put up just for a moment. And just point out that the average of the 102 climate models is 1 degree centigrade increase over those 36 years. And the observations are a half a degree. So not wildly different, it's half, but it's still looks like a straight line up from 1976 to 2015. And then replace it with Exhibit A from Dr. Mann, which is exactly half a degree from 1979 to 2015. Those two data sets are very, very clear. And I asked Dr. Mann, so the 102 isn't 1 degree over that 36-year period of time, it's only half a degree centigrade or 1.8 Fahrenheit. And we also looked, two other quick data sets. The CO2 parts per billion in 1979 was 330. They were around 403 in 2016. So we have a 30 or 73 parts per billion increase, and is now increasing at 3 parts per billion per year and increasing according to the EPA. What does Dr. Christie's line look like in 2030, 2040, 2050?
Yeah, well, as we see in that comparison, the various surface and lower atmosphere temperature data sets all agree pretty well on the warming over the past few decades. And so we can get into discussions about what's happening in the mid and upper troposphere. But at the surface, there's a pretty clear consistency among the records. And the records are consistent with the models. And that has been demonstrated in numerous publications. And the models allow us to project forward. So we can feed the models with different possible scenarios for future fossil fuel burning. And it turns out that given sort of business as usual burning of fossil fuels, if we don't do anything to stem our ongoing burning of fossil fuels and the increased elevation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we will probably cross 2 degrees Celsius warming. That's about 3.5 Fahrenheit warming of the planet relative to the pre-industrial time in a matter of a couple decades. It's an important number because that amount of warming is what most scientists who've studied the impacts of climate change will tell you is when we truly get into dangerous and potentially irreversible changes in climate. So we'll be there in a couple decades if we don't do something about the problem.
I think that's my larger point, too, is that Dr. Christie argues that we didn't get close to the 102 average model, but it's still significantly upward direction. And if back to my India trip, they say when they bring the other 300 million people get electricity, that will be a 40% increase in what we expect the greenhouse gases to be. One more quickly, I only have a minute, yes, but Dr. Mann, when you were at University of Virginia, the American Tradition Institute, you used the FOIA stuff to try to get all of your emails. And Chris Horner and David Snarr were 2 ATI attorneys who sued UVA. David Snarr apparently was doing this on a pro bono basis while he was a full-time EPA employee, and according to letters from the EPA, never did get permission. I'd like to submit those for the record, Mr. Chairman, without objection. The letters from the EPA. One final thought. Dr. Curry, you just said, and I quote, "I'm not out there on the fringes." Would you consider Dr. Christy and Dr. Pielke out there on the fringes?
Absolutely not.
Who is out there on the fringes, or is there a fringe?
There are some fringes. People who are questioning the fundamental thermodynamics of the, of the greenhouse effect and things like that. There are some fringe things. You do see a few papers published in fringe journals. There are some people out there on the fringe that I would call out there on the fringes. Who knows? Occasionally I read the papers just to try to keep an open mind. They always send them to me. But I would regard that as out there on the fringes. I don't regard myself, John Christy or Roger Pielke, as out there on the fringes. I think there's a lot of scientists who share our perspective and who agree with us and who are not part of the politically active publicly the rank and file, the research geeks, who a lot of them out there agree with us. I hear from them all the time, especially from scientists working at government agencies who are afraid to speak out. I hear from a lot of them.
Yeah,
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Byer. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lahood, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony here today. Appreciate it. Dr. Pielke, I wanted to start with you, and was glad to hear your history of serving on this committee as a staffer and for George Brown. He was a Democrat, correct, that served here?
That's right.
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Pielke, have you ever felt attacked by a colleague because of your position on climate change science?
Yes. I mean, and it just happened. I mean, I was just called fringe or suggested to be fringe, and I've come here representing the science that's in the IPCC report. It's almost a bizarro sort of reaction to be called fringe when you're representing mainstream science.
And let me ask you, has Dr. Mann ever directed negative comments to you in your work?
Yeah, I'm not interested in the food fight with Dr. Mann. I hope everyone takes a look at the YouTube of this testimony and sees Dr. Mann speaking and listens carefully. But he's a respected scientist. He's the leader of the climate change movement in the United States, and I think everyone deserves to see his behavior at this hearing.
And as I understand it in the past, and this is public record, Dr. Mann has referred to you as, quote, a carnival barker and also, quote, a contrarian pundit. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I can't keep up with all of Dr. Mann's epithets.
And Dr. Curry, to you, have you ever felt attacked by a colleague because of your position on climate change science?
The only one who's really attacked me publicly and vociferously is Michael Mann, and you heard, some of that today, including being called a denier in his congressional testimony. Most scientists are very respectful of my perspectives and want to engage me in debate.
And Dr. Christy, same question for you in terms of being attacked by a colleague because of your position on climate change science.
I try to forget all that, and so I'd rather not comment anymore. It's just something that shouldn't happen. I'm sorry it does. Gotcha.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess as I've listened to the testimony here today, and I guess, Dr. Mann, I would ask you, as I understand it, you are involved currently with a defamation lawsuit about comments that were made about you that is currently pending in the D.C. Circuit. Is that correct?
I'm not going to speak about that here. It's not appropriate to do so.
And I guess what I would question, I've read that defamation suit and I'm familiar with it, and I'm really perplexed in trying to figure out the rationale and the reasoning for engaging in those type of statements that relate to direct threats and bullying. And you mentioned in your opening statement about staying away from that. And yet we have a suit that's been filed based on those exact same things. And if the real goal is to get away from harassing and silencing critics, that does not seem to be the type of language you'd want to engage in. And there's a real disconnect between a defamation suit that does the exact same thing, but you're engaged in that in this public forum. Do you want to comment on that?
So I'm not going to talk about the suit, but I do want to clarify that there are a number of statements that have been attributed to me that are not correct. I don't believe I called anybody here a denier, and yet that's been stated over and over again. So I've been misrepresented quite a bit today by several people.
It's in your written testimony. Go read it again.
What I talked in the written statement, I described scientists who either deny the science or who reject its impacts, something to that effect. I did not call you a climate change denier, and so that's just a misstatement.
So,
it's been repeated here. But let me state that there's a difference between disagreeing with people, which is not only appropriate but critical in science, to have honest and frank discussions of uncertainty, to disagree, to call out those statements that you don't believe to be supportable. That is completely appropriate. That's very different, for example, from an accusation of misconduct or fraud. Those are two completely different things, and it's unfortunate that in your question, you are conflating those two groups of things.
Well, that's your opinion, Dr. Mann, but are you denying that as it relates to Dr. Pielke's work on climate change science, that you didn't call him a carnival barker or a contrarian pundit?
You would have to provide me the context. I don't remember everything I've ever said or done, but what I can tell you is that Dr. Pielke has made the following statement. This is a quote. In the Wall Street Journal, he said, "There is scant evidence to indicate that hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, or drought have become more frequent or intense in the U.S. or globally." That is simply not true. The best available science is now attributing individual droughts and floods at a fairly high level of confidence to climate change. So do I challenge him publicly when he says things like that? Of course I do. Is that appropriate? Of course it is.
So are you denying, let me ask you this, is it fair to say you could have said that and you don't remember that here today?
I don't remember everything that I've ever said, and you would have to provide me the context. I'm not sure that your characterization is correct. You would have to show me the context, and you haven't done that.
I'd be happy to show you that. I guess my point is, you seem overly sensitive to criticism as it relates to the defamation suit that engages in the same activity that you're engaged here today with these three witnesses, and I think there's some hypocrisy in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lahood. And with that objection, I'll put into the record, if it's not already a part of the record, page 6 of Dr. Mann's written testimony today, where Dr. Curry, he says, climate science denier Judith Curry. I assume that is you he is wrongfully referring to. But
climate science, it wasn't climate change, that's different. But
Climate science denier Judith Curry.
I think that...
And I've described the science that she's denying.
That clearly contradicts what Dr. Mann said.
I've described the science that she's denying.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized.
Well, thank you. As a PhD physicist, I'm just very interested in how this is sort of a very strange mixture of science and not. And so maybe I'd like to try to understand what the range of agreement is here. Is there anyone on the panel here that believes, for example, that on the policy side, that the cutbacks in climate science, space-based measurements of things like temperature, ice sheet thickness, and so on at NOAA, NASA, EPA, and other places, of the magnitude contemplated in the skinny budget of the Trump administration are in fact a good idea? Is there anyone who believes that those cutbacks are a good idea?
Well, you know, as a scientist, we live on observations and data, and that's how we learn and discover things that will help us. So I'm all for the observing systems being made robust.
Well-funded, and so there is a consensus, actually, that that's not a good idea. Let's see, on the physics point of view, if we sort of go to the other end, yeah, Dr. Curry, you indicate that your criteria for what represented fringe were just rejection of fundamental thermodynamics and so on. That does everyone on this panel agree, for example, that the temperature of the Earth is set in general terms by radiative balance, and that the infrared absorption spectra of carbon dioxide is a very relevant driving term, and that the uncertainty really is in the other positive and negative feedback terms that may or may not be present. Changes in the convection, things, many of which simply redistribute where the excess heat goes when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The other ones, potentially increase or decrease the albedo of the Earth, things like that, where there is, you can imagine mechanisms that either make things better or worse. For example, if we melt the methane release that could come from Siberia, if we melt all of the swamps in Siberia, basically, that they're very possibly a very strong positive as well as negative feedback loops. Is that sort of the range of disagreement that we're seeing here? Anyone feel themselves outside of that? And so that. Is there anyone that feels that that range of uncertainty makes it likely that this is never going to be a problem if we continue business as usual? So you all would agree that it's more likely than not that this will be a big problem? Yes.
I would say that we don't know.
No. Do you think it is more likely than not that this would be a big problem?
I would say as likely as not.
All right, Dr. Mann, do you?
Well, I just want to say that's what I'm talking about. I didn't call Judith Curry a climate change denier here today. There is a statement in the written statement that she's a climate science denier, and this is precisely what I'm talking about. She has argued that we might be responsible for less than 50% of the warming that we have seen. The IPCC has assessed that. They've actually estimated the likelihood that that could be true. It's 1 in 10,000. 1 in 10,000 is the likelihood of something that she claims to be true. That is a rejection of basic accepted science.
Models.
That is a rejection
Based on
of
climate
science.
models.
It's a rejection of science.
I have argued that the climate models are not fit for that purpose.
It's a rejection of accepted science.
No, it's a rejection of a manufactured consensus. That's what I reject.
Well, just one last statement.
If we could separate from temperatures for a minute. The question of ocean acidification, is there an agreement that as you raise CO2 levels in the atmosphere, that this will lead to ocean acidification, or is that also sort of thought of as a fringe point of view? So that one there is agreement on, because that has very severe environmental consequences, obviously, that are not, it's interesting that they're not really under debate.
The environmental consequence, our understanding of the ecological impacts of ocean acidification is in its infancy, and how this relates to ecosystems. I mean, we don't know very much about how slow rates, highly variable ocean acidification impacts ecosystems. It's something
That
whose
could be either
investigation.
better or worse than our current best estimate.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. The other sort of general question is, what is the proper response to fringe? How do you set what is defined as a fringe opinion? You know, in physics conferences, there's always a poster session where you have people that say Einstein was wrong, you know, and they're very sweet people with a variety of science credentials. And it's always a delicate thing trying to understand. You know, I've often gone and had conversations with these people, listened to their very interesting theories, and yet they're not given plenary talks at this thing. And so what is the right way to handle that? How many standard deviations do you have to be out of the mainstream before it is acceptable to do that? And yeah, well, Dr. Curry, how would you?
Okay, well, the point is you ignore these things if you don't find them interesting or convincing. Okay, you ignore it. Okay, and most of these things don't have any particular consequence to our engineering, our technologies, or to the most consequential, you know, science issues of the day. So you just ignore it. There's no reason to squash it. Okay, you just, if somebody catches somebody's attention and you look at it and you consider it, and maybe it tweaks something in your brain about, oh, that's, you know, there is some sort of line suggested by this that maybe we should explore, or you ignore it. There's no reason to squash it or even particularly define it. You just don't pay attention to it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Foster. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here. This is, there for a while, I thought you guys were in the Republican conference debating Obamacare repeal. So, Dr. Curry, being from Georgia, I appreciate you being here again. If I recall last year, and you were here in part of your testimony, well, let me just ask you the question this way. Do you believe that the climate is changing?
Absolutely. Climate has always changed.
Do you believe that human activity could be a cause?
Oh, it is a cause. It does contribute.
So you actually do believe that it does?
Sure. The question is whether it's the dominant cause.
Right.
Okay, and even the IPCC says more than half. Okay, that's from 51% to 99%. That's a big.
So you don't deny that human activity?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I just don't know how much is human versus how much is natural. And I think there's a great deal of uncertainty, and it's very difficult to untangle it.
Is that uncertainty possibly because we don't really fully understand what causes this climate machine?
Absolutely. Our understanding of climate dynamics on decades to century to millennial timescales is far from complete.
Okay. Dr. Christy, the same question. You believe that there's change in the climate?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that it's possible that human activity could contribute to it?
I actually have a couple of papers showing how humans have affected the temperature, mainly through the surface thermometers, urbanization.
It doesn't sound like either one of you are deniers of.
And the carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It can't not absorb infrared energy.
Okay. Dr. Mann, obviously you think climate is changing. Do you think that it's possible that human activity is not the dominant factor?
So I already spoke to that. Judith Curry is on record, and we just heard it.
No, I'm asking you.
Well,
What do
saying
you
less
think?
than 50%. It might be less than 50%. The IPCC actually has a very nice
I'm asking,
plot.
what do you think?
I believe what the IPCC has said about this, that the proposition that we are responsible for less than 50% of the warming can be dismissed as a 1 in 10,000
what
proposition.
do you think? Are you just, I don't want you to
accept the
parrot what
consensus.
IPCC says.
I accept the world scientist's opinion. I
So
accept
in
consensus.
your opinion, there could not be no chance that human activity is not the major contributor.
Well, it's a double negative, but there is a possibility we'll wake up tomorrow and gravity no longer exists.
Okay, so
those are possible.
Okay, so
but they're extremely
it doesn't sound
unlikely.
like anybody or any amount of data could convince you otherwise at this point.
I go with the physics.
Okay,
you
so
can go with opinions if you
we
want.
could say
I go with
you're
physics.
a denier of natural change.
No, my career in large part was built on my studies of natural variability. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation that Judith Curry loves to talk about, that was coined by me. My early studies
let me ask you
established
this
the
question.
importance of internal oscillations in the climate.
I'm not trying to be
I just want to inform. No, I just want to make sure you know that. Yep.
Okay. Do you believe that we truly understand what creates the weather? What is do we understand the climate machine?
So the weather is caused by what we call baroclinic instability. I'd be happy to talk to you
I mean,
for hours
do you
offline
disagree
about
with
that.
Dr. Curry that you sound like that we have grasp in science that we know what creates this weather patterns and we know what creates
I'm not
the
sure
weather
how to
machine.
parse that question. We understand at a great level of detail the workings of the atmosphere, the workings of the ocean and the ice sheets and the way they interact. Thousands of scientists have been studying these things for decades. We understand the science of climate as well as the science of just about any other field.
I don't want to filibuster. I'm running out of time here. So why did we ban?
I would just like to add that
Yes.
when we understand other fields of science, we can predict the behavior.
Right.
I've demonstrated we cannot predict the behavior.
Okay, the National Academy of Science agrees with you. At least they did in the 1970s when it said we do not have a good quantitative understanding of our climate machine and what determines its course. Without the fundamental understanding, it does not seem possible to predict the climate. Why did we have a ban on sulfuric dioxide in the 1970s, Dr. Mann?
Yeah, so you're right that more than 40 years ago, we didn't have nearly the understanding we have today. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences actually said they didn't know what was going to win out. They didn't say that global warming isn't caused by increasing greenhouse gases. What they were saying in that report was that we don't know what's going to win out, the warming effect of increasing greenhouse gases or the cooling effect of these particulates
So there was
that we are
differences
producing.
among the scientific community because, as was mentioned earlier, there was a cooling trend.
We understand very well where that came from.
But the policy result was the reaction of lawmakers in banning sulfuric dioxide in response to the cooling trend that a group of scientists said was definitely causing the cooling of the earth. And I just refer back to Dr. Curry.
Can I answer?
Dr. Curry, does this show evidence of that we really don't have a full grasp of what causes the climate change? And I think what your thing is, we may overreact in public policy that could actually have a diminishing factor in.
The gentleman's time has expired. Do you want to answer very quickly, Dr. Curry?
That's okay.
Okay. I'm sorry, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, has unanimous consent request.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have a report here entitled "What Triggers Ice Ages," and I would like to have that entered into the record.
Without objection. And the gentlewoman from Texas has a unanimous consent request, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter into the record an article published in Scientific American that debunks the claim that there was a pause in global warming, and I'd also like to enter into the record a blog post by the Union of Concerned Scientists that breaks down Dr. Lindsay's letter to President Trump.
Okay, without objection, and the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Esty, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to return again to the question a little bit about the topic here is on scientific process. Do we have agreement that the scientific process is about proposing hypotheses, testing them, revising, and continuing to do that in the ultimate goal of trying to arrive at some sort of truth? That's the objective. Never attained in its entirety, but that's the objective. If there's agreement, and I'm getting nods that is, in layperson's terms, the understanding of scientific process, what do people think we should be funding research to do in the area of climate, recognizing that there are bands within which humans will not survive on the Earth if it goes outside those bands? Does anybody think that cutting climate funding for research should happen now, given the robust disagreement on this panel? Because there are proposals on the table that right now to cut planetary science funding, to stop NOAA from looking at, to stop NASA from looking at this, because of a disagreement about how to interpret and prioritize those results. Dr. Curry, do you believe we should be funding more science or less scientific research in this field?
Different.
Different, okay, but let's be clear, The proposals in the so-called skinny budget from the president would be for cutting that research.
Yeah, it's a matter of priorities. Spending more money on climate model taxonomy isn't going to get us anywhere. Spending more money on observing systems will.
Which would be NASA, for
Yeah,
example.
and
Correct.
spending more money on fundamental understanding, theory regarding climate dynamics on a range of timescales, that would pay dividends.
And those are some precisely the ones that are being cut in the proposals on the table right now. So I'm glad to see there's agreement that I think you agree with those of us on this panel that would like to see that funding continue to try to determine this. Our job will be to take the science and to try to make public policy decisions. Clearly, there's not total certainty here. However, if the risk is sufficiently great, we take steps even without certainty. I'm part of a resiliency caucus that is looking at things we can do to design safer buildings so we survive storms better, whether they're tornadoes or hurricanes. We take steps, most of us carry insurance on our homes, even though we've probably never lived in a home that's burned to the ground. So in addition to whatever you discover and whatever the disputes may be about science, there's significant research showing that humans have some impact, right? Some, and we're not talking trivial either. I don't think anyone at this table has talked trivial impact. So I believe we should be continuing to fund research, but make no mistake, even if it's, whether it's 20%, 30%, 50%, the consequences to human beings now and in the future are significant. I want to note that I was at a conference 15 years ago, Rand Corporation conference, talking about how the next wars would be over water. This is a national security issue. So even if, for example, overall water patterns, the amount of rainfall is the same, where it flows, when it flows, how fast it comes down, has major implications for crops, major implications for the stability of other countries. So I think these are the kinds of issues that we should be funding, because it's not simply a question of who gets the research dollars. The consequences for this country are very grave for our citizens. So I would ask you as much as possible to join us in funding robust research, and then let those of us in elected positions make decisions in that band of uncertainty. Because I can tell you right now, the constituents in my district in Connecticut are deeply concerned at what they see as an overt politicization of science right now. And I'm afraid we saw that in this room today, which I deeply regret, and I hope we can get agreement to fund robust, open source research that allows decision-making by this body in light of that uncertainty. So I will side, however, with Dr. Mann that at some point we have to go with consensus for the timing as we continue research. And I would say that is the prudent course, is to go with consensus while continuing research. That doesn't mean stopping research. That means continuing research, and yet we cannot wait for final, ultimate truth to make decisions. And with that, I yield back my 12 seconds.
Thank you, Ms. Estey. Thank you all for your testimony today. This has obviously been enlightening, sometimes a little contentious, but nevertheless informative to all of us who are up here. Appreciate your attendance, and we stand adjourned.